Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for another discography ranking, and today we are going to be doing a ranking of the 1970s post-punk pioneers, Joy Division. Alright, some background for everybody in case you're not familiar. Joy Division was formed in the city of Salford, directly in the heart of Manchester, in the wake of the Sex Pistols' inaugural concert there on the 4th of June 1976, a concert that actually inspired the formation of a lot of bands, including the Buzzcocks, The Fall, and even indirectly the Smiths. Bassist Peter Hook and guitarist Bernard Sumner, along with drummer Terry Mason, attended the concert and were inspired to form a trio, at which point they placed an advertisement in a local newspaper for a vocalist so as to form a quartet. This was answered by Ian Curtis from Cheshire, who had also, as it turns out, been at that same Sex Pistols show. The band would be called Warsaw, and the members wanted to take sonic inspiration both from punk as a genre, but also from more kind of modernist, avant-garde experimental music, like the most recent David Bowie album, Low, which the group was collectively a major fan of. Drummer Mason would eventually transition into a management role within the band, and after two more drummers kind of came and went, the group settled on Stephen Morris from Cheshire, a schoolmate of Curtis's. Changing their name to Joy Division in early 1978 to avoid confusion with another London punk band that was using the name Warsaw, the band recorded and self-released an EP and were later signed to the nascent label Factory Records in the fall of that year. Factory Records, of course, is a very notable label. They would go on to become one of the most respected underground labels in London, fronting and advertising bands such as Happy Mondays and the Darude Column. Very fascinating legacy that I have not explored that much personally, but after doing this Joy Division dive, I'm excited to check out some of their other artists and works. Factory's success can in part be attributed to Joy Division's first record, which was also the first album released by Factory, Unknown Pleasures, in 1979, which was surprisingly successful and sort of lifted the band to this sort of musical vanguard position. The mixture of punk rock attitudes with these sort of introspective and very dark lyrics and these very massive soundscapes courtesy of producer Martin Hannett would eventually give the band credit as being an early example of what we consider post-punk as a genre. Sadly, the band's premature ending is so well known that it has pretty much become mythologized at this point. After recording a new album in early 1980, the band was preparing for their first US tour and were set to depart from Manchester Airport on the 18th of May. That departure, of course, never materialized, nor did the tour. The night before, vocalist Ian Curtis took his own life. The reasons for Curtis's suicide have been the source of debate for years, but it's known that Curtis was balancing a myriad of personal issues, being in the middle of a divorce case at the time, and medical issues as well. Curtis was epileptic. He was diagnosed shortly after the band formed, and he was having more frequent seizures at that point, including in the middle of performances. It was becoming disruptive to a number of their live gigs, and he had voiced concern that he would not be able to go on performing because of his condition, and he was concerned about how American audiences might interact and react to that situation. Curtis was also on a litany of medications for his epilepsy, which some believe may have been a factor in his depression worsening over time. But again, a lot of this is conjecture at this point, and we'll never conclusively know what the cause was. Whatever the case, the band disbanded with their final record, Closer, coming out 2 months after Curtis's death, along with the non-album single Love Will Tear Us Apart, which went to number 13 in the UK, becoming by far their biggest hit. The band would officially reform in October of that year, with Sumner now on vocals and Morris's girlfriend, Gillian Gilbert, on keyboards and vocals, but under a different name, New Order. New Order, of course, has continued off and on until the present day, really, with a distinct legacy and discography of their own that takes more influence from things like American dance music, specifically the club scenes of New York, but we'll get to them another day. So as mentioned, Joy Division only have 2 albums, so this won't exactly be a lengthy discography ranking. I did consider saving these and doing a joint Joy Division New Order ranking at some point, But the two bands are so fundamentally different in a lot of ways, despite having, a lot of crossover between members, that I don't think it would be fair to either one if I were to sort of rate them and discuss them as being interchangeable. Not included in this ranking will be Joy Division's debut EP, An Ideal for Living, released on the 3rd of June, 1978. It is by far the most punk-sounding thing Joy Division ever did, with some of their most abrasive guitars on tracks like Warsaw, and it is also the most low-fidelity thing they ever did, really without much question, and I do think that is to the band's detriment in this case. It's interesting, but I would not say it's especially high quality, even compared to a lot of punk rock that was coming out at that point, so I would consider this kind of a completist's release. That said, fans of their two proper records should absolutely pick up the compilation Substance. The CD version in particular compiles almost every non-album track they ever released, including the whole of An Ideal for Living, as well as their non-album singles. I think these songs fit in nicely as context for their other releases, and in particular, having Love Will Tear Us Apart in your collection is pretty much essential. I mean, it's maybe their best melody that they ever put on record, and it's probably the best Curtis sounds as a vocalist as well. So between that and then obviously the tragedy surrounding its release, there's no surprise why it was by far their most successful song ever. So Substance, absolutely an essential addition to your collection if you don't already own it. But yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and get right on into these two albums. There is no wrong order for talking about these two albums. I think both of these are incredibly high quality, and I probably, depending on the day, could honestly have one over the other. But in the moment right now, after hearing these records, in one case for the first time, in another case for the second time, I'm going to go with, at number 2, 1979's Unknown Pleasures. To me, this record was a record that I struggled with, I think, the first time that I heard it. Not necessarily to the point of disliking it, but to the point of not understanding entirely what the appeal was. But hearing it again just really made it open itself up to me in a lot of different ways. I think from my standpoint, as someone who is not an expert on post-punk and is still trying to familiarize myself with it, I think this record really opened my ears to kind of what it does so well, which is kind of take that rebellious nature, this sort of dissatisfaction and aggression that you hear in punk music, and also kind of taking that and then taking the musical focus and not necessarily focusing on just pure aggression, but more on atmosphere. I know that the band and their relationship with producer Martin Hannett was complicated in the sense that they didn't always agree. In fact, probably often disagreed with a lot of the decisions that Hannett made. But man, I think he serves these two records so well as far as creating this sense of space here. There's a lot going on with kind of the guitar layering and the bass lines. Oh my God, the bass lines. Peter Hook, one of the best bass players I've heard recently, certainly one of the best bass players of the era. But he's able to kind of create that space as a producer between all these different things that are going on, and gives each instrument and the vocals, of course, this chance to shine. I think there's a lot of kind of heavier songs on this record, which you won't necessarily see as much with Closer, or if you do, it's going to be in a different way. So in a way, maybe you could argue this is a more one-dimensional record than Closer is, and maybe that's why I have it at number 2. But I mean, for what this dimension is, I think it kicks ass. As I said, I think Peter Hook is pretty much the rock of this record with how he writes these bass lines. There's so much of a sense of melody, so much of the sense of contour with those bass lines. I love where songs where Sumner's guitar kind of goes back and forth with that bass, where sometimes it will kind of bounce off of it, maybe doing some arpeggiations in the background, and sometimes we'll go in lockstep with that bass. The track New Dawn Fades on this record, I think, really exemplifies that. It's probably my favorite song on here because of it. I also love tracks where they show kind of their tendency towards writing hooks. Disorder, the opening track, I think is a good example of that. They're already picking up on these dance music sounds to some level. I think the bass line there, again, is fantastic. Again, the production, I think, is a triumph here. There's so much space here. I love these kind of swirling sound effects that Hannett adds as like these kind of accents at different points. It's so well done. And of course, on this record, you have to talk about Ian Curtis, someone who, people criticize his vocal abilities, and I understand that. Technically, by no means is he a good singer, but I do think that as an expressionist, I suppose, even if he's not technically a quote unquote good singer, I was impressed by him, certainly on several points. Especially tracks like Day of the Lords, I think is a good example, when he kind of goes back and forth between this monotonous style that I think people associate him with and these really kind of engaged, almost maniacal screaming, like where he's shouting out, "Where will it end?" In the fade out of Day of the Lords. I think that's a great example of that. It feels like a taste of the live performances that the band was offering at that time, which, there's very little documentation of them, but the reports that people have are that they were very engaging band live, and that Curtis was a really odd and fascinating performer. Like, you couldn't take his eyes off of him because of his movements, which then some people believe were actually tied into his epileptic seizures, and that he was kind of almost willing himself into these pseudo-epileptic fits on stage as kind of an artistic statement. It's so strange. It's so interesting. But, and I love how they're able to kind of capture that attitude, even in moments, in this very studio product here. So, Unknown Pleasures, it's a dark record, it's a heavy record, the heavier of the two albums, I think, without much question. And absolutely, I could see why people would have this at number one. For me right now, it's number two by a very slim margin, but it's absolutely fantastic, and might even be my recommended starting point if you're looking to get into Joy Division at first. So, Unknown Pleasures, number two. And of course, that means that number one is going to be 1980s Closer. And I really was not expecting to prefer this to the debut album. This was the Joy Division record that I had not heard before, recently kind of exploring their stuff. But after that first listen, I think I do prefer it, again, ever so slightly. And I think the reason for that is you still have some of these dark textures from the debut, but there's also a sort of subversive catchiness to a lot of the songs here that is present in some of the stuff on Unknown Pleasures, certainly, but not necessarily everything. I kind of separate this album, I think a lot of people do, but I separate this album into kind of two distinct sides. The first side of the album is where I think the band explores even more with these very like macabre sort of dance beats. Again, anytime they're doing something that is like dance adjacent or what have you, it's always kind of counterbalanced by things like those weird synth sounds that they do in Isolation, or the very kind of disinterested vocals that Curtis is performing in Passover. But there's a lot of like great moments. And again, I think this is maybe where you can hear like the dawn of New Order a little bit, as far as how they are kind of writing melodies, how they're incorporating things like bass lines and drum patterns into these kind of ideas of hooks. But again, I think the instruments lock in so well here that they almost make you maybe they don't make you forget the lyrics and how depressing and dark a lot of them are, but at least they make me feel like I can let out my angst on the dance floor a little bit. I think the second side is where this record really starts to dig into these kind of darker ideas, particularly the song 24 Hours, I think would fit very well into Unknown Pleasures without much sonic difference. But I also think they're digging into different territories here. For example, I think the closing track, Decades, makes more liberal usage of arpeggiating synths. That's kind of the common denominator. There's a bit more active synth work on this record. As well as that song, I think, has a great sense of dynamics. You have these sparser verses that pair with these more grandiose choruses. Also, one of Curtis's better vocals on the record as well. I would say that overall on this album, Curtis's vocals are a little bit weaker, worse than they are in Unknown Pleasures. I feel like he's really leaning into what I would describe as maybe his Jim Morrison on Xanax impression. I do think his vocal tone sounds a lot like Morrison's at points, even if he's obviously isn't half the singer that Morrison was. But again, I guess that sort of disparity or discord there is part of the appeal. And I think what makes these songs as statements work so effectively overall. I also really love the synth piano in the song The Eternal, played by Bernard Sumner. I think that is absolutely stunning. It sort of kind of steps over these atmospheric synth pads. I don't remember how you describe them, but you think of like these presets on keyboards that are quote unquote vocals or choir ahs or something like that, that almost sound like the kind of wailing that you associate with the Mellotron, but that's kind of what's going on here. And the two of them work so brilliantly. It's such a spacious song, an absolute dirge overall, and I cannot get enough of it. Very possibly my favorite Joy Division song overall. And, you know, I talk about angst, and I talk about this idea of, you know, darkness in these lyrics. And I don't mean to be patronizing while doing it, because this record obviously has a legacy surrounding it that is completely tied to Curtis's suicide. I mean, however much you want to try to interpret if these lyrics are intentional foreshadowing or not, we're never really going to know. And there's no way to avoid that kind of hovering over the record and affecting its legacy tremendously. But what I do want to say, I suppose, is I think this album would have been very well received, extremely critically well received, certainly, regardless of whether or not Curtis had survived. I think the lyrics would pack a hell of a punch, even if Curtis was still here. I think that the musicianship speaks for itself. I think the sonic experimentation speaks for itself. And I think that, you know, it's interesting to kind of think of this alternative timeline, like what if Joy Division had continued? And some people tend to believe that Joy Division probably would not have continued much longer. Maybe Curtis would have just stepped back because of his health problems, and maybe New Order would have existed on some level regardless. The band always said that they would change their name if any of their members ever left. So maybe the actual timeline wouldn't have been all that different, apart from maybe Ian Curtis would still be with us today, potentially. But, you know, I think regardless of Curtis taking his own life, I think this album packs a hell of a punch, and I think is really remarkable and really incredible. And if you can get past the barrier that is his vocals, without a doubt, there's a lot to love here. You can get immersed in this atmosphere. You can sink into these grooves in whatever sort of pseudo masochistic way you want to. And yeah, I think it's an achievement. It's a remarkable achievement. And while, again, either of these records could be my number one, I think they're both remarkable albums and absolute classics in their genre, I give the edge to Closer right now. I think it's phenomenal. And I really implore everybody to check both of these records out. And with that, I think that wraps this video up. Please let me know your thoughts. What are your rankings of Joy Division's 2 records? Which album do you prefer? If any, what are your thoughts on their EP? Any of their singles? Do you have a favorite song? Let me know. Like, comment, and subscribe, so that we can go ahead and kind of get that discussion started here. So yeah, comment down below. Make sure to like and subscribe as well to see more videos like this, more album reviews. More of those always, of course, are to come. Hit that bell for notifications as well, and tell a friend in addition to that. Thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate it. And I will see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.